There is no more American phrase than as American as apple pie. You've heard it your whole life. Politicians say it, advertisers live by it. Soldiers in World War II said they were fighting for it. But apple pie is not American. Not the fruit, not the recipe, not even the phrase itself. Every single piece of the story you've been told is wrong. And the real story? It's stranger, older, and far more interesting than anything they taught you in school.
And here's what we're going to find out today. We're going to trace apple pie back to its real origin. And it doesn't start in America. It doesn't start in England either. It starts in a mountain range in Central Asia, over 4,000 years ago. And by the time we get to the end of this story, there's going to be one more twist, one that changes what American actually means. Stay with me.
First, why does anyone believe this in the first place? Because the myth was built carefully, layer by layer. Grandmothers baked apple pie. Diners put it on every menu. Norman Rockwell painted it. During the Second World War, American GIs, when reporters asked them why they were overseas, fighting in places they'd never heard of, they said, "For Mom and apple pie." That image stuck in the American imagination like almost nothing else. By the 1950s and 60s, the phrase had become cultural shorthand. Wholesome, safe, undeniably American. It showed up in school textbooks, in presidential speeches, in advertisements for everything from automobiles to life insurance. And nobody questioned it. Because why would you question apple pie? Here's why. Because when you pull back the curtain on that image, when you actually look at the history, what you find is that every single layer of it was built on something that came from somewhere else entirely. And the first layer, the most basic one, is the apple itself.
Let's start with the fruit. Apples are not native to North America. The wild ancestor of every apple in every pie ever baked in America originated in the Tian Shan mountain range, a remote region in what is now Kazakhstan, in Central Asia. The species is called Malus sieversii, and it still grows wild there today, in the same forests where it grew 4,000 years ago. From Kazakhstan, the apple traveled west, through ancient Persia, into the Mediterranean, across the Roman Empire, where it became one of the most cultivated fruits in the ancient world. The Romans developed dozens of varieties and carried them across Europe as their empire expanded. By the time any European set foot in North America, the apple had already been a European fruit for over 1,000 years. Now, here's the part that stops most people cold. When English colonists arrived in New England in the 1600s, there were apples in North America, but they were nothing like what you'd put in a pie. Native American crab apples were small, hard, and so bitter they were nearly inedible. Every sweet apple the colonists ever tasted came from seeds they brought across the Atlantic for Europe. The fruit in your American apple pie is an immigrant, and so is the recipe.
The oldest written apple pie recipe in existence is not from America. It's from England. And it was written in 1381, 640 years ago. More than 3 centuries before the United States existed as a country. That recipe, preserved in a medieval English cookbook, calls for apples, figs, pears, raisins, saffron, and a blend of warm spices, all baked inside what they called a coffin, not a dessert shell, a pastry container that wasn't meant to be eaten at all, just used to hold the filling while it cooked. Over the next 2 centuries, the recipe evolved. Dutch bakers in the 1500s developed a double-crusted version, 2 layers of pastry, sealed together, much closer to what we recognize today. Swedish cookbooks from the same period describe nearly identical preparations. By the time the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, apple pie had already been a European staple for over 200 years. They didn't invent it. They packed it in their luggage. Now, America's first cookbook, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons, was published in 1796. It does include apple pie recipes, but those recipes are nearly identical to the English versions that had been circulating for 4 centuries. What Americans eventually did was refine the pie. More cinnamon, more sugar, the flaky, buttery crust that defines the modern American version. America's contribution to apple pie was real, but it was evolution, not invention. So we've established the fruit came from Kazakhstan, the recipe came from medieval England. Which brings us to the part of the story that almost nobody knows. the phrase.
As American as apple pie. That phrase is so embedded in American culture that it feels ancient, like it's always been there. Like the founders said it. They didn't. Apple pie existed in America for well over 200 years before anyone ever described it as a symbol of national identity. Go through American literature, political speeches, and newspapers from the 1700s and early 1800s. Apple pie is mentioned as a food. Nothing more. A common, everyday dessert. The phrase started appearing in newspapers and magazines in the early 1900s. But it didn't become a national motto until the 1940s and 1950s, when advertising agencies realized it was one of the most powerful emotional triggers they had ever found. By the post-war boom, companies were using apple pie to sell everything. Refrigerators, life insurance, breakfast cereal, suburban homes. The image of a golden pie cooling on a kitchen windowsill became a shorthand for everything America wanted to believe about itself after the war. Safety, prosperity, normalcy, home. And the soldiers? The ones who said they were fighting for mom and apple pie? That phrase was actively shaped and amplified by US government communications and media. It was a morale narrative, a slogan, carefully crafted and distributed. The symbolism wasn't ancient. It was manufactured in the same decade as the television set. Now, here's where most people expect this story to end. With the myth debunked, with apple pie exposed as a borrowed recipe built on imported fruit and wrapped in a marketing slogan. But that's not where this story ends. Because there's one more thing to understand, and it changes everything. Here's the thing about apple pie that nobody talks about. The fact that it came from somewhere else doesn't make it less American. If anything, it makes it the most American food that exists. Think about what the story of apple pie actually is. A fruit from Kazakhstan, cultivated by Romans, perfected by English and Dutch bakers, carried across the Atlantic by European immigrants, planted in New England soil, adapted over 3 centuries of American kitchens, made sweeter, butterier, more indulgent, and eventually claimed by an entire nation as its own. That is the American story, not a single origin. Not a pure, unbroken tradition handed down from one people in one place, but layers, migration, adaptation, reinvention, until something foreign becomes so woven into the fabric of daily life that the entire nation forgets it ever came from anywhere else. Apple pie didn't get here by accident, and it's not alone. The hamburger came from Hamburg, Germany, the hot dog from Frankfurt, French fries trace back to Belgium, pizza came from Naples, tacos are Mexican, bagels are Eastern European Jewish, fried chicken, one of the South's most iconic dishes, descends from techniques brought by enslaved West Africans, who were the actual cooks in Southern kitchens for generations. The American table is the most culturally layered dining table in human history, and apple pie sits at the head of it. Not because America invented it, but because America loved it completely enough to forget it was ever anything else.
And then there's Johnny Appleseed. If you grew up in America, you know the story. A gentle wanderer in a tin pot hat, traveling barefoot across the frontier, scattering apple seeds across the land, so that future generations could have fresh apple pie. That image is so deeply embedded in American folklore that it's taught in elementary schools across the country. Almost none of it is accurate. John Chapman, that was his real name, was a real person. He did travel the Ohio River Valley in the early 1800s, planting apple trees across thousands of miles of frontier land. But here's what the story leaves out. The apples he planted were not sweet dessert apples. They were not pie apples. They were small, bitter, and almost entirely unfit for eating raw or baking. They were used to make hard cider. In early 19th century America, hard cider was the most commonly consumed alcoholic beverage in the country. It was safer than water in many places. Families drank it daily. And Johnny Appleseed, the real one, was essentially a cider industry pioneer, planting orchards that would supply frontier settlements with alcohol,
not dessert. The wholesome, apple pie-loving Johnny Appleseed that Americans grew up with is largely the creation of a 1948 Walt Disney animated film. The real man was far more interesting, and far more human. Whether it's the Disney version or the real one, Johnny Appleseed represents something genuine about America's relationship with food. The impulse to plant, to cultivate, to take what you've been given and make something from it in new soil. That impulse is real, even if the details were cleaned up for children.
Let's be precise about what America actually contributed, because it's not nothing. When European apple seeds were first planted in New England soil in the 1600s, something unexpected happened. The American climate, the cold winters, the particular soil of the Northeast, produced apples unlike anything that had ever grown in Europe. New varieties emerged that existed nowhere else on Earth. The Baldwin, the Rhode Island Greening, the Roxbury Russet, American apples, grown from European stock, shaped by American land. By the 1800s, American apple cultivation had become one of the most sophisticated in the world. Hundreds of distinct varieties were developed. The industry spread west, from New York and Pennsylvania, through Virginia, and eventually into the Pacific Northwest. And in American kitchens, the pie itself was transformed. The crust got flakier, richer. The filling got sweeter. The ratio of cinnamon to sugar became something specific, something that if you've ever had apple pie in another country, you know immediately is different. That version, the American version, is a real culinary achievement, born from a European recipe, shaped by American ingredients, perfected over 3 centuries in American kitchens. It may not have been invented here, but it became something here that it never was anywhere else. The story of apple pie is really the story of American identity itself. America has always been better at adopting things than inventing them. It happened with food, with music, with language, with people. As American as apple pie is technically wrong, but it points at something true. Apple pie is American, not because it was invented here, but because this is where it became what it is. This is where it got the double crust and the brown sugar, where it got the 4th of July and the county fair, where it got the soldiers and the bumper stickers, and the grandmother's recipe written in pencil on an index card. America didn't invent apple pie. America made it mean something. And the next time you sit down to a slice, at a diner, a holiday table, or straight from the pan on a Tuesday night, you're eating something that traveled from the mountains of Kazakhstan, through Rome and London and Amsterdam, across an ocean, through 3 centuries of American kitchens, and ended up exactly where it was always going to end up, on an American table. That's not a myth. That's the real story. And it's a better one.
And if you enjoyed this, hit subscribe. We do this every week for a different food you thought you knew. And if you want to know which other American foods were never American, the next video is right there.